The brake line was cut clean through. I stared at the severed metal cable dangling beneath my car, my hands trembling as the mechanic's words echoed in my head. This wasn't an accident. This was Sarah's third attempt on my life, and this time, I had the evidence. But what she didn't know was that I'd been preparing for this moment for months. I wasn't the same frightened girl who'd barely survived her first 2 murder attempts. This time, I was ready. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Emma Claire Mitchell, and 18 years ago, I disappeared without a trace during a family camping trip in the Sierra Nevada mountains. I was 8 years old when I wandered away from our campsite, got lost in the wilderness, spent 3 days alone before a park ranger found me unconscious and severely hypothermic. What my family never knew was that I hadn't just gotten lost. I'd been running from something, or rather someone. But my memories of those days were fragmented, buried beneath layers of trauma and time. The hospital kept me for weeks, and during my recovery, something strange happened. The doctors noticed signs of long-term psychological trauma that couldn't be explained by just 3 days in the woods. There were old injuries, healed fractures that didn't match any accidents my parents could remember. The medical team suspected abuse, and before my parents could take me home, Child Protective Services stepped in. What followed was a legal battle that lasted months, during which I was placed in a specialized psychiatric facility for children. My parents, Robert and Patricia Mitchell, were devastated. They owned Mitchell Properties and Development, one of the most successful real estate companies in Riverside Heights, California. Our family had lived in the same Victorian mansion on Maple Street for 4 generations, and losing their only child threatened to destroy everything they'd built. The community rallied around them, treating me as if I had died rather than simply been taken away. In their grief and desperation to fill the void I'd left behind, they made a decision that would change all our lives forever. They adopted Sarah Grace, a 6-year-old girl from the foster system who had her own tragic backstory. Sarah's biological parents had died in a car accident when she was 4, and she'd been bounced between foster homes ever since. She was sweet, articulate, and desperate for a permanent family. My parents saw her as a gift from God, a chance to heal their broken hearts and give a deserving child the life they'd planned to give me. What none of us realized at the time was that Sarah had been the reason I'd run into those woods 18 years ago. The memory came back to me in pieces after I returned home 6 months ago. I'd been living independently in San Francisco, working as a trauma counselor and slowly rebuilding my life after aging out of the psychiatric system at 18. Through years of therapy and my own psychological training, I'd learned to process the fragmented memories that had been locked away since childhood. It was Dr. Amanda Chen, my mentor and former therapist, who helped me understand that my brain had protected me by burying the truth of what happened that night at the campsite. Sarah had been with us on that camping trip, not as my sister, but as the daughter of family friends who had joined us for the weekend, okay? While our parents sat around the campfire talking and drinking wine, Sarah had cornered me near the edge of the forest. Even at 6 years old, she'd displayed a calculating cruelty that chilled me to remember. She'd pushed me down a steep embankment, watching as I tumbled into the darkness below. When I'd climbed back up, bruised and crying, she'd whispered that, if I told anyone what happened, she'd make sure I disappeared forever. That night, terrified and confused, I'd run. My 8-year-old mind couldn't process what Sarah had done or why, but my survival instincts kicked in. I'd rather face the unknown dangers of the wilderness than stay another moment with someone who wanted to hurt me. When the park rangers found me days later, I was too traumatized to explain what had happened. The hypothermia and dehydration had affected my memory, and the adults around me assumed I'd simply gotten lost like any curious child might. Sarah, meanwhile, had played the perfect concerned friend. She'd helped my parents search for me, crying appropriately and expressing worry about my safety. When I was taken away by CPS, she'd been there to comfort my grieving parents. It was no coincidence that they'd chosen to adopt her. She'd positioned herself perfectly to slide into my life, and my absence had given her the opportunity she'd been waiting for. Returning to Riverside Heights after 18 years felt like walking into a museum of my own childhood. Kept all the exhibits had been carefully curated to erase my existence. The Mitchell family home still stood proudly on Maple Street, its Victorian gingerbread trim freshly painted and the gardens meticulously maintained. But as I walked up the familiar stone pathway, I noticed that something was fundamentally different. This wasn't the house I remembered from my fragmented childhood. Memories. My old bedroom had been converted into Sarah's art studio, filled with canvases depicting idyllic family scenes that never included a dark-haired daughter. The family portraits that had once lined the hallway now showed only 3 people: Robert, Patricia, and Sarah, smiling together at various family milestones I'd missed. Even the height marks on the kitchen door frame, where my father had once measured my growth, had been painted over and replaced with Sarah's measurements starting from age 6. When I rang the doorbell that October afternoon, my mother answered. With the kind of polite confusion she might show to any stranger, Patricia Mitchell had aged gracefully. Her auburn hair now streaked with silver, and her face bearing the lines of someone who'd lived through profound loss. She didn't recognize me immediately, which shouldn't have surprised me given how much I'd changed, but the delay in recognition felt like a knife to my chest. It was my father who finally understood who I was. Robert Mitchell had always been an imposing man, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that commanded respect in boardrooms and country club dining rooms. When he appeared behind my mother and saw me standing on their doorstep, his face went completely white. For a moment, I thought he might faint. The reunion I'd imagined for years was nothing like what actually happened. There were tears, yes, but they weren't tears of joy. My parents seemed almost frightened by my return, as if I were a ghost come back to haunt them. They invited me in, of course, but there was a hesitancy in their movements, careful distance that spoke volumes about how thoroughly they'd moved on from the daughter they'd lost. Sarah appeared at the top of the grand staircase like a vision from a fairy tale. At 24, she'd grown into the kind of beauty that graced magazine covers. With platinum blonde hair that caught the light and green eyes that sparkled with what most people would mistake for warmth, she was wearing a cream-colored cashmere sweater and designer jeans that probably cost more than most people made in a month. Everything about her presentation was calculated to project perfection. From her subtle makeup to the delicate gold jewelry that caught the afternoon light streaming through the stained glass windows. "Mom, Dad, who's at the door?" she called. Down sweetly, but I could see the moment she recognized me. Her expression flickered for just an instant, revealing something cold and predatory before the mask of surprise and delight slipped back into place. "Oh my goodness," she gasped, hurrying down the stairs with practiced grace. "Emma, is it really you? After all these years?" Before I could respond, she was embracing me, and to anyone watching, it would have looked like the most natural thing in the world. 2 sisters reuniting after a lifetime apart. But as her arms wrapped around me, I felt her fingernails dig slightly into my back, just enough to remind me of that night 18 years ago when she'd pushed me into the darkness. "We thought you were dead," she whispered in my ear, her voice barely audible to our parents. "Would have been better if you had stayed that way." The dining room where we sat for that first awkward reunion was a monument to the life I'd been excluded from. The mahogany table was set with the family china I remembered from special occasions. But the conversation felt like a carefully choreographed performance. My parents asked polite questions about where I'd been and what I'd been doing, but their attention kept drifting to Sarah, who played the role of the devoted daughter perfectly. She asked all the right questions, expressed concern about my years in institutional care, and even seemed genuinely interested in my work as a trauma counselor. But I noticed how she steered the conversation away from any discussion of my childhood, memories, or the circumstances of my disappearance. Every time I tried to mention that camping trip, she would smoothly redirect the discussion to something else. "Emma's been through so much," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand with false sympathy. "We should focus on the future now, not dwell on painful memories." My parents nodded in agreement, clearly grateful that Sarah was handling the situation with such maturity. They'd raised her to be their perfect daughter, and she was performing the role flawlessly. I could see how completely she'd won their hearts over the past 18 years. how thoroughly she'd convinced them that she was everything they'd ever wanted in a child. It was during that first dinner that I learned about the engagement. Danny Brooks, who had been my best friend before I disappeared, was now Sarah's fiancé. He arrived halfway through the meal, letting himself in through the back door with the familiarity of someone who'd become part of the family. When he saw me sitting at the dining room table, his face went through the same transformation my parents had. Shocked, followed by a complicated mixture of emotions I couldn't quite read. Danny had grown up to be exactly the kind of man I'd imagined he would become. Tall and athletic, with dark hair and the kind of smile that had probably broken hearts throughout high school and college. He worked for his family's construction company now. From the way my father spoke about him, it was clear that Brooks Construction did a lot of business with Mitchell Properties. The engagement wasn't just romantic, it was also a strategic business alliance. "Emma," he said quietly, and I could hear 18 years of questions in the way he spoke my name. "Hello, Danny," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Congratulations on your engagement." Sarah immediately moved too, his side, slipping her arm through his with possessive ease. "Can you believe Emma's finally come home to us?" she said brightly. "I've told Danny so much about you over the years, about how much I missed having a sister." The lie was so smoothly delivered that I almost admired her skill. She'd spent 18 years crafting a narrative where she was the loving sister who'd never stopped hoping for my return, rather than the person who'd orchestrated my disappearance in the first place. Danny looked between us with confusion, clearly struggling to reconcile his childhood memories with the reality of Sarah's presence in my family. Over the following weeks, I tried to settle back into life in Riverside Heights, but it became increasingly clear that there was no place for me in the life my family had built without me. Sarah had filled every role I might have occupied. She was the daughter who helped my mother plan charity events at the country club. She was the heir apparent to the family business, having earned an MBA and worked her way up through the company hierarchy. She was the beloved granddaughter-in-law that my father had never had, bringing Danny's family into their social circle and expanding their business network. Most painfully, she was the woman who was about to marry the boy I'd once planned to marry myself. Danny and I had made those innocent childhood promises that seemed silly to adults but felt earth-shattering to 8-year-olds. We'd carved our initials into the old oak tree in the backyard and sworn we'd be together forever. Now he was wearing Sarah's ring and planning a wedding that should have been mine. I found temporary lodging at a bed and breakfast downtown while I figured out my next steps. My parents had offered to let me stay in the guest house on their property, but something about Sarah's too bright smile when she suggested it made my skin crawl. I'd learned to trust my instincts over the years, and every instinct I had was screaming that I wasn't safe around my adopted sister. The first attempt on my life came 3 weeks after my return. I was driving back from dinner with Dr. Chen, who had driven up from San Francisco to check on how I was adjusting to being back home. It was a foggy November evening, the kind of weather that made the narrow roads around Riverside Heights treacherous, even for experienced drivers. I was taking the winding route through the hills that led back to town when my brakes failed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The car was a rental, a small sedan that I'd been driving since I didn't own a vehicle. As I approached a sharp curve with a steep drop-off to one side, I pressed the brake pedal and felt it go straight to the floor. No resistance, no slowing, just the horrifying realization that I was careening toward a guardrail that was the only thing standing between me and a 100-foot drop into the canyon below. Years of therapy had taught me to think clearly in crisis situations. Instead of panicking, I downshifted into first gear and steered toward the hillside on the inside of the curve. The car scraped along the rocky embankment, metal shrieking against stone. But the friction was enough to slow me down before I reached the guardrail. I came to a stop with my front bumper just touching the metal barrier, my hands shaking so hard I could barely turn off the engine. The police report listed it as mechanical failure. The rental company apologized profusely and paid for my medical expenses, even though I'd only suffered minor cuts and bruises. But when I had the car towed to an independent mechanic the next day, he found something the police had missed. A brake line had been cut, not enough to cause immediate failure, but enough to ensure that the fluid would leak out gradually until the brakes failed completely. I didn't report this finding to the police. I had no proof of who might have sabotaged my car. And I knew that pointing fingers at my adopted sister would only make me look paranoid and unstable. Instead, I started paying closer attention to my surroundings and taking precautions that my years in the psychiatric system had taught me. I varied my routines, checked my vehicle before driving, and most importantly, I started documenting everything. The second attempt came a month later, during the annual Mitchell family Christmas party. It was a tradition that went back generations, a lavish celebration that drew the elite of Riverside Heights to our family home. Sarah had thrown herself into planning the event, transforming the mansion into a winter wonderland with thousands of white lights and enough flowers to stock a florist shop. I'd been hesitant to attend, but my parents had insisted. They seemed to be making an effort to include me in family traditions, though I suspected Sarah's influence in convincing them that my presence would show the community how well adjusted and forgiving the Mitchell family was. I was, after all, a testament to their capacity for love and their commitment to family healing. The party was everything I remembered from my childhood, elegant and overwhelming in equal measure. The women wore cocktail dresses that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and the men discussed business deals over glasses of whiskey that were older than I was. I felt like an outsider looking in on a world that should have been mine. Wearing a simple black dress I'd bought off the rack while surrounded by people draped in designer labels, Sarah was in her element, gliding through the crowd like a born hostess. She'd chosen a stunning red gown that complemented her blonde hair perfectly, and she wore the heirloom Mitchell diamond necklace that should have been passed down to me. Every few minutes, she would appear at my side with a bright smile and a cutting comment disguised as sisterly concern. "You look tired, Emma," she said during one of these encounters. "Are you sure you're feeling well? You've seemed a bit unsteady." This evening, I hadn't been feeling unsteady until she mentioned it, but as the evening progressed, I began to notice that she was right. My vision was starting to blur slightly, and I was having trouble focusing on conversations. At first, I attributed it to the overwhelming nature of the social situation and the emotional stress of being back in my childhood home. But as the symptoms worsened, I began to suspect something more sinister. The revelation came when I excused myself to use the bathroom and overheard Sarah talking to one of her friends in the hallway outside. They didn't see me approaching because I'd removed my heels to walk more quietly on the marble floors. "She's always been fragile," Sarah was saying in a voice dripping with false concern. "All those years in psychiatric facilities really affected her stability. I'm worried she might have some kind of episode tonight with all these people around." "How awful for your family," her friend replied. "Do you think she's dangerous?" "Oh, I don't think she'd hurt anyone else," Sarah said carefully. "But she's been talking about feeling hopeless lately, about how she doesn't belong anywhere. I'm just concerned she might hurt herself, especially with all the medication she's been taking." I wasn't taking any medication, but I realized with growing horror what Sarah was doing. She was laying the groundwork for my death to be ruled a suicide. Whatever she'd put in my drink was designed to make me appear unstable and disoriented. And if I died tonight, everyone would remember this conversation as evidence of my deteriorating mental state. I slipped back into the party and found Danny, standing alone on the terrace, looking out over the garden where we'd played as children. He turned when he heard my footsteps, and I could see the confusion and pain in his eyes that had been there since my return. "Emma," he said quietly, "are you okay? You look pale." "Danny, I need you to listen to me very carefully," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the growing dizziness. "I think Sarah put something in my drink. I need you to take me to the hospital right now." He stared at me for a long moment, clearly struggling with whether to believe what I was saying. "Emma, that's a serious accusation. You're sure you're not just overwhelmed by everything tonight?" Before I could answer, Sarah appeared beside us, as if she'd been watching from the shadows. "There you are, Emma," she said with concern that sounded genuine to anyone who didn't know better. "I've been looking for you. You seem upset." "I was just telling Danny that I'm not feeling well," I said carefully, watching her face for any telltale signs. "Oh, you poor thing," she replied, moving closer with what appeared to be sisterly solicitude. "You've been under so much stress lately. Maybe you should lie down for a while. I can help you up to your old room." The idea of being alone with Sarah in an isolated part of the house while drugged made my blood run cold. Actually, I think, I need some fresh air, I said, stepping toward the garden. Don't be silly, Sarah said, her hand closing around my arm with surprising strength. It's freezing out there, and you're clearly not thinking straight. Come on, let me take care of you. Danny was watching this exchange with growing unease, and I could see him starting to question what was really happening. Maybe we should call a doctor, he suggested. That's not necessary, Sarah said quickly. Emma just needs some rest. She's been having these episodes since she came back. Haven't you, Emma? It was a masterful performance, painting me as unstable while positioning herself as the caring sister. But I'd learned a few things about manipulation during my years in therapy, and I wasn't going to let her control the narrative. Danny, I said, looking directly into his eyes, do you remember what you promised me when we were 8 years old? Under the oak tree in the backyard? His face changed as the memory hit him, the childhood promise that had seemed so important to both of us. I remember, he said quietly. Then you know I'm not crazy, and you know I wouldn't lie to you about something this serious. Please take me to the hospital. For a moment, the three of us stood in a tense triangle on the terrace, the sounds of the party continuing inside while we faced off in the December cold. Then Danny nodded and stepped toward me, away from Sarah. I'll drive you, he said simply. Sarah's mask slipped for just an instant, revealing a flash of pure rage before the concerned expression returned. Of course, she said sweetly. I'll come with you to make sure Emma gets the help she needs. No, Danny said firmly. I think Emma and I need to talk alone. The hospital confirmed what I already knew. There were traces of benzodiazepines in my blood, drugs that would have made me drowsy and disoriented before potentially causing respiratory failure in high enough doses. The doctor who treated me was required to report suspected poisoning to the police. But when the detectives interviewed Sarah, she expressed shock and concern for my mental health. She suggested that I might have taken the drugs myself as a cry for help, pointing to my history of psychiatric treatment and my difficulty adjusting to life back home. Once again, there was no proof of her involvement. The party had been crowded, and dozens of people could have had access to my drink. Sarah had witnesses who could testify to her whereabouts throughout the evening. Her performance of the worried sister was flawless. The investigation went nowhere, officially classified as possible self-harm pending further evidence. But this time, I had Danny as a witness to her behavior, and seeds of doubt had been planted in his mind. Over the following weeks, he began to distance himself from Sarah, asking questions about discrepancies in her stories and paying closer attention to the dynamics between us. Sarah noticed his changing attitude and began working overtime to win back his full loyalty. But the foundation of trust had been shaken. That's when I knew the third attempt was coming, and this time I was going to be ready. The invitation to the family cabin arrived on a Tuesday morning in February, delivered by Mrs. Martinez, our longtime housekeeper, who seemed genuinely excited about the prospect of a family reconciliation. The cream-colored cardstock bore Sarah's elegant handwriting, inviting me to join the family for a long weekend at our mountain retreat in the Sierra Nevada foothills. It was presented as an opportunity for healing, a chance for the Mitchell family to bond away from the distractions and pressures of Riverside Heights. Sarah had orchestrated the entire weekend with her usual attention to detail. Schedules arranged for catering, and even hired a professional photographer to document what she called our new beginning as a complete family. The gesture appeared thoughtful and inclusive, exactly the kind of initiative that would earn her praise from our parents and admiration from the community members who would inevitably hear about her efforts to welcome me back into the fold. But I knew better. 3 months had passed since the Christmas party incident, and during that time, I'd been carefully documenting every interaction, every conversation, every seemingly innocent comment that revealed Sarah's true intentions. I'd installed security cameras in my bed and breakfast room, started recording phone calls, and most importantly, I'd been working with Dr. Chen to develop a comprehensive safety plan. The mountain cabin held special significance for our family. Built by my great-grandfather in the 1920s, it sat on 50 acres of pristine forest land about 2 hours northeast of Riverside Heights. The rustic lodge-style structure featured massive stone fireplaces, hand-hewn log walls, and enormous windows that offered breathtaking views of the surrounding wilderness. It had been the site of countless family gatherings over the decades. A place where the Mitchell family retreated to reconnect with nature and each other. It was also completely isolated, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through dense forest for nearly 3 miles before reaching the cabin. Cell phone service was sporadic at best, and the nearest neighbor was more than 5 miles away. If something happened to me at the cabin, it could be hours or even days before anyone found me. Assuming anyone bothered to look, Dr. Chen had advised against accepting the invitation, pointing out the obvious dangers of putting myself in such a vulnerable position. But I had reached the decision point in my life where I could no longer continue living in fear of Sarah's next move. For months, I'd been reactive, constantly looking over my shoulder and jumping at shadows. It was time to take control of the situation and force a resolution, even if it meant putting myself at risk. I spent 2 weeks preparing for the weekend, treating it like a military operation rather than a family vacation. I researched the cabin's layout, studied the surrounding terrain, and identified multiple escape routes through the forest. I purchased a satellite communicator that would work even in areas without cellular coverage, programmed it with emergency contacts, and tested its functionality repeatedly. Most importantly, I arranged for Dr. Chen to expect regular check-ins at predetermined times, with instructions to contact law enforcement if I failed to respond. The drive to the cabin on Friday afternoon felt like a journey into the past. Danny had offered to drive me, a gesture that hadn't gone unnoticed by Sarah, who'd managed to insert herself into the passenger seat while relegating me to the back. The conversation during the 2-hour drive was carefully neutral, focusing on safe topics like the weather, the condition of the mountain roads, and plans for the weekend activities Sarah had organized. My father followed behind us in his Range Rover with my mother as his passenger, their vehicle loaded with enough supplies for a week-long stay rather than a simple weekend getaway. Sarah had insisted on bringing everything we might need, from gourmet food and fine wine to board games and outdoor equipment. She'd thought of every detail, creating the perfect setting for a family bonding experience that would be remembered fondly by everyone who survived it. The cabin looked exactly as I remembered from my childhood visits, though years of careful maintenance had kept it in pristine condition. The wraparound porch still featured the same rustic rocking chairs where my grandmother used to sit and watch for wildlife, and the massive stone chimney still dominated the structure's profile against the forest backdrop. Sarah had arranged for the caretaker to stock the refrigerator and start fires in both the main fireplace and the smaller one in the master bedroom, creating an atmosphere of warmth and welcome that masked the underlying tension. Dinner that first evening was a carefully choreographed performance of family harmony. Sarah had prepared a feast that showcased her culinary skills, serving dishes that had been family favorites during my childhood. She'd even recreated the specific way my mother used to set the table for special occasions, with the good china and cloth napkins that transformed casual meals into formal dining experiences. Throughout the meal, she played the role of the perfect daughter and hostess, ensuring everyone's wine glass stayed filled and steering the conversation toward positive memories and future plans. She spoke enthusiastically about her upcoming wedding to Danny, describing the venue they'd chosen and the elaborate celebration they were planning for the following fall. My parents beamed with pride as she outlined her vision for the future. She included expanding the family business and eventually providing them with grandchildren who would carry on the Mitchell legacy. I participated in the conversation when directly addressed, but mostly I observed and listened, noting the subtle ways Sarah worked to exclude me from the family narrative she was constructing. When my father mentioned a business opportunity that might interest me, she quickly redirected his attention to a related project she was developing. When my mother asked about my work as a trauma counselor, Sarah expressed amazement at my dedication to helping troubled individuals, managing to make my career choice sound both admirable and slightly unstable. Danny remained largely quiet throughout dinner, responding when spoken to, but clearly struggling with internal conflicts I could only guess at since the Christmas party incident. Our relationship had shifted into an uncomfortable middle ground where he no longer automatically accepted Sarah's version of events, but wasn't ready to fully embrace my accusations either. His presence at this family gathering felt more like an obligation than a choice, and I wondered if Sarah had pressured him into attending against his better judgment. After dinner, we gathered around the massive stone fireplace in the main living area, the adults nursing glasses of my father's expensive scotch, while Sarah regaled us with stories from her recent business travels. She'd visited potential development sites in 3 different states, exploring opportunities for Mitchell Properties to expand beyond California. Her presentations to potential investors had been universally successful, and she was clearly being groomed to take over the company when my father retired in a few years. The fire crackled and popped in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the log walls and creating the kind of cozy atmosphere that should have fostered genuine family bonding. But beneath the surface warmth, I could feel the tension building, like pressure in a sealed container. Sarah's performance was flawless, but I caught glimpses of something darker in her eyes when she thought no one was looking. She was working toward something, building toward a climax that would resolve the threat to her perfect life once and for all. When we finally retired for the evening, I discovered that Sarah had arranged the sleeping assignments with her usual attention to strategic detail. My parents occupied the master bedroom on the main floor, while Sarah and Danny were given the large guest room adjacent to the kitchen. I was assigned to the small bedroom in the cabin's loft area, accessible only by a narrow staircase and isolated from the other sleeping areas by both distance and the building's layout. The loft bedroom was charming in a rustic way, with exposed wooden beams and a window that offered views of the forest canopy. But it was also a tactical nightmare from a security perspective. There was only one way in or out. The staircase was old and creaky, and the room's location made it impossible to hear what was happening in other parts of the cabin. If someone wanted to isolate me from potential help, they couldn't have chosen a better location. I waited until I was certain everyone else was asleep before beginning my own preparations. Using the small flashlight I'd brought, I carefully examined the room for potential weapons or escape routes. The window opened onto the cabin's roof, which sloped down toward the back of the structure where a large oak tree grew close enough to provide access to the ground. It wouldn't be an easy escape route, but it was possible if I found myself trapped with no other options. I placed the satellite communicator under my pillow where I could reach it quickly, set my phone to vibrate every 2 hours so I could send the scheduled check-in messages to Dr. Chen. The device barely had 1 bar of signal, but it was enough to send text messages if I kept it near the window. Most importantly, I positioned myself so I could see the bedroom door on the top of the staircase, giving me advance warning if anyone approached during the night. Sleep came in fitful intervals, interrupted by the natural sounds of the forest and the settling noises of the old cabin. Every creak of the wooden structure made me alert. Every gust of wind in the trees outside had me listening for footsteps that might not belong to the night. But the hours passed without incident, and when morning came, I felt both relieved and disappointed that my suspicions had proven unfounded. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold, with frost covering the cabin's windows and the kind of brilliant sunshine that made the forest look like a winter wonderland. Sarah had planned a full day of activities designed to showcase the property and create opportunities for family bonding. We would hike the marked trails that crisscrossed the property, visit the small lake where my grandfather had taught me to fish. The hiking expedition began after a hearty breakfast that Sarah had prepared with obvious pride. She'd packed lunches for everyone and loaded a backpack with water bottles, first aid supplies, and emergency equipment that demonstrated her thorough planning. My father praised her organizational skills, noting that she'd thought of details that might not have occurred to less experienced outdoors enthusiasts. The main trail that wound through our property was well maintained and clearly marked, following a gentle incline that offered spectacular views of the surrounding mountains. Sarah led the group with confident strides, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the property's history that she'd learned from our parents over the years. She moved through the forest like someone completely at home in the wilderness, her expensive hiking boots and designer outdoor clothing somehow managing to look both practical and fashionable. About an hour into the hike, we reached a scenic overlook that had been one of my favorite spots during childhood visits. The rocky outcropping provided panoramic views of the valley below, where a ribbon of silver marked the course of the mountain stream that eventually fed into the larger river system. It was here that Sarah suggested we take a break and enjoy the lunches she'd prepared. The picnic spot was perfect in almost every way, offering both spectacular scenery and comfortable seating on the sun-warmed rocks. Sarah distributed sandwiches and thermoses of hot coffee, playing the role of the attentive hostess even in the wilderness setting. She'd remembered everyone's preferences, from my father's love of roast beef to my mother's preference for turkey and Swiss. She'd even included homemade cookies that replicated a recipe our grandmother had used for special occasions. It was while we were eating that I noticed something odd about my sandwich. The bread was slightly different from the others, darker and more dense, as if it had come from a different loaf. When I mentioned this observation, Sarah laughed and explained that she'd run out of the regular bread and had to use a different variety for mine. It was a perfectly reasonable explanation, delivered with the kind of casual confidence that would have satisfied most people. But I'd learned to be suspicious of anything that singled me out as different from the rest of the family. Instead of eating the sandwich, I wrapped it carefully in its original packaging and slipped it into my jacket pocket, claiming I wasn't hungry enough to eat right then. Sarah watched this action with interest, though she didn't comment on my apparent lack of appetite. The rest of the hike passed without incident, though I noticed that Sarah seemed increasingly agitated as the day progressed. She checked her watch frequently and appeared to be waiting for something that wasn't happening on schedule. When we returned to the cabin in the late afternoon, she immediately busied herself with dinner preparations, declining offers of help, and insisting that cooking relaxed her after a day of outdoor activities. Dinner was another elaborate production, featuring grilled steaks and vegetables that Sarah had marinated in what she claimed was a secret family recipe. The meal was delicious and perfectly prepared, but I found myself picking at my food rather than eating with enthusiasm. Something about the way Sarah watched me during the meal made me cautious about consuming anything she'd prepared. After dinner, my father suggested we build a fire in the outdoor fire pit and spend the evening stargazing. It was a tradition from my childhood, one of the few activities that had remained unchanged despite the years that had passed. Sarah embraced the idea enthusiastically, claiming she'd brought marshmallows and chocolate for making s'mores, just like we used to do when I was young. The fire pit was located about 50 yards from the cabin, in a clearing that provided an unobstructed view of the night sky. My father and Danny worked together to build the fire, while my mother and Sarah arranged chairs in a circle around the stone-lined pit. The scene was so reminiscent of childhood memories that for a moment, I almost forgot the underlying tensions and dangers that had brought us to this point. As darkness fell and the fire grew stronger, we settled into our chairs with blankets and hot drinks, watching as the stars became visible in the clear mountain air. The conversation was relaxed and nostalgic, focusing on family stories and shared memories that seemed to bridge the gap between past and present. For the first time since my return to Riverside Heights, I felt like I might actually be part of the family again. That feeling lasted until Sarah excused herself to use the bathroom, claiming she would return shortly with the ingredients for s'mores. She'd been gone for nearly 20 minutes when Danny noticed that smoke was beginning to rise from the direction of the cabin. At first we assumed it was simply smoke from the chimney, but as the minutes passed it became clear that something was wrong. The smell reached us before we could see the flames, the acrid scent of burning wood and synthetic materials that spoke of a fire that was out of control. Ow! My father jumped to his feet and ran toward the cabin, with Danny close behind him. My mother and I followed more slowly, both of us struggling to process what was happening. The cabin was engulfed in flames by the time we reached it, the fire consuming the structure with a ferocity that suggested it's been burning for much longer than we'd realized. The entire back section of the building was already lost, and flames were beginning to spread toward the front where our vehicles were parked. The heat was so intense that we couldn't get within 50 feet of the structure, let alone attempt any kind of rescue effort. Sarah appeared from the direction of the cars, her face streaked with what appeared to be soot and tears. She was screaming about how she'd tried to go back inside to save our belongings but had been driven back by the smoke and heat. She claimed she'd been attempting to retrieve photo albums and family heirlooms from the main bedroom when the fire had spread too quickly for her to escape through the front door. My father was already on his phone, though the call kept dropping due to the poor cellular coverage in the area. Danny had run to his truck to retrieve a fire extinguisher, but it was clearly inadequate for a blaze of this magnitude. We were helpless to do anything but watch as decades of family memories went up in smoke. That's when I realized what Sarah had really been doing during her extended absence from the fire pit. This wasn't an accident or an unfortunate coincidence. She had deliberately set the cabin on fire, timing it perfectly to occur while we were all safely away from the structure. But something had gone wrong with her plan because I was supposed to have been inside the cabin when the fire started. The sandwich from lunch had been drugged, just like my drink at the Christmas party. Sfera had expected me to become drowsy during our evening around the fire pit, giving her an excuse to help me back to the cabin to rest. Once I was unconscious in the isolated loft bedroom, she would have started the fire and rejoined the family at the fire pit, establishing her alibi while I burned to death in what would appear to be a tragic accident. My decision not to eat the drugged sandwich had saved my life, but it had also forced Sarah to improvise. She'd set the fire anyway, probably hoping that the chaos and confusion would provide another opportunity to ensure I didn't survive the night. But for the moment, I was alive and aware of her true intentions, which made me more dangerous to her than ever before. As we stood watching the cabin burn, I felt Sarah's eyes on me, calculating and cold despite the tears streaming down her face. She was already working on her next move, adapting her plan to account for this setback. The weekend wasn't over yet, and she still had time to finish what she'd started. The fire department arrived 2 hours later, summoned by a call my father had finally managed to make from the one spot on the property that had reliable cell service. By then, the cabin was completely destroyed, reduced to a smoldering pile of ash and twisted metal that bore no resemblance to the family retreat where we'd shared so many memories. The firefighters confirmed what we already knew, that the structure was a total loss, and nothing could be salvaged from the wreckage. The fire chief explained that old log cabins like ours were particularly vulnerable to fast-moving fires, especially during the dry winter months when the wood was at its most combustible. He noted that the blaze appeared to have started in multiple locations simultaneously, which sometimes happened when embers from a fireplace were carried by wind to different parts of the structure. It was a reasonable explanation that satisfied everyone except me. We spent the night in a motel in the nearest town, a rundown establishment that was the only lodging available on short notice. The contrast between the luxury of the cabin and the shabby motel rooms was stark. But my parents seemed more concerned about the loss of family heirlooms and irreplaceable photographs than their temporary discomfort. Promises that the cabin could be rebuilt even better than before, using modern materials and safety features that would prevent similar disasters in the future. I lay awake in my motel room that night, processing everything that had happened and planning my next moves. Sarah had escalated beyond anything I'd imagined, willing to destroy a family landmark and decades of memories to eliminate me. The fact that she'd been prepared to kill our parents and Danny as collateral damage spoke to a level of desperation and ruthlessness that terrified me. But I was still alive, and I now had evidence of her true nature that went beyond my previous suspicions. The drugged sandwich was still in my jacket pocket, and I was confident that laboratory analysis would reveal the same. Benzodiazepines that had been found in my blood after the Christmas party incident. More importantly, I had a clearer understanding of how Sarah operated and what she was capable of doing. The drive back to Riverside Heights the next morning was somber, with my parents grieving the loss of their family retreat and making tentative plans for dealing with insurance claims and reconstruction decisions. Sarah was appropriately subdued, expressing regret about the tragedy, while subtly positioning herself as the family member best equipped to handle the practical details of moving forward. Danny was quieter than usual, and I noticed him watching Sarah with a new wariness that suggested his doubts about her were growing stronger. The fire had shaken him, particularly Sarah's account of her heroic but unsuccessful attempt to save family belongings. Something about her story didn't ring true to him, though he wasn't yet ready to voice his suspicions openly. When we arrived back in Riverside Heights, I thanked my family for including me in the weekend and expressed appropriate sadness about the loss of the cabin. But privately, I was already planning my response to Sarah's latest attempt on my life. The next move would be mine, and this time, I intended to make sure it was the final one. The engagement party was in full swing when I received the message. The Riverside Heights Country Club glittered with crystal chandeliers and hundreds of white roses. While Sarah moved through the crowd like a queen, accepting tribute from her subjects, she wore a stunning ivory gown that made her look ethereal, and the massive diamond on her finger caught the light with every gesture. To everyone watching, she was the perfect bride-to-be celebrating the happiest night of her life. But I saw something different in her eyes when she looked at me across the crowded ballroom. There was a predatory satisfaction there, the look of someone who knew a secret that would change everything. She'd been planning this moment for months, and now the endgame was finally within reach. The text message came during the cocktail hour, sent to my phone from an unknown number. "Meet me in the Rose Garden at 10. Come alone. It's time we settled this once and for all." There was no signature, but I knew it could only be from Sarah. She was done with subtlety and half measures. Tonight, one of us wouldn't be going home. I had been preparing for this moment since the cabin fire. The recording device hidden in my evening clutch was voice-activated and connected to cloud storage. The GPS tracker sewn into my dress would broadcast my location to Detective Santos and Dr. Chen every 30 seconds. Most importantly, I had learned from Sarah's own methods, and I was no longer the defenseless victim she expected me to be. At 9:45, I excused myself from the reception and made my way through the country club's French doors onto the moonlit terrace. The Rose Garden was Sarah's favorite spot on the property, a carefully manicured maze of pathways and flowering bushes that provided perfect privacy for intimate conversations. It was also isolated enough that screams wouldn't carry to the main building, which made it an ideal location for what Sarah had planned. She was waiting for me at the center of the garden, standing beside the ornate fountain that had been donated by my great-grandfather decades earlier. In the moonlight, she looked almost spectral in her white gown, like a vengeful spirit risen from the grave. The sweet scent of roses hung heavy in the night air, masking the metallic smell of the kitchen knife she held loosely at her side. "Hello, Emma," she said calmly, as if we were meeting for afternoon tea rather than a final confrontation. "I was wondering when you'd figure it out. You always were too clever for your own good." "I figured it out 18 years ago," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "I just didn't have the strength to do anything about it then." Sarah laughed, a sound like breaking glass in the quiet garden. "Strength? Is that what you call running? Away and hiding in psychiatric facilities for most of your life? You've never been strong, Emma. You've always been weak. And that's why you're going to lose tonight, just like you lost everything else." She began walking slowly around the fountain, the knife glinting in the moonlight as she moved. "Do you know how easy it was to take your life? Your parents were so grateful to have a daughter who didn't disappoint them at every turn. Danny was so relieved to have someone who understood him without all your complicated emotional baggage. Even your precious inheritance was simple to redirect once everyone accepted that you were never coming back," said, matching her pace around the fountain while maintaining distance between us. "And that terrified you." "Terrified." Sarah's voice rose with indignation. "I wasn't terrified. I was annoyed. You were supposed to stay gone, Emma. You were supposed to accept that your life belonged to me now and disappear. Quietly, like the pathetic waste of space you've always been." The mask was finally slipping away completely, revealing the true Sarah underneath. This was the person who had pushed an 8-year-old child down an embankment and threatened to make her disappear forever. This was the sociopath who had spent 18 years methodically erasing every trace of my existence while building herself a perfect life on the foundation of my identity. "The brake line was inspired," I said conversationally, continuing our deadly dance around the fountain. "Clean, simple, and almost impossible to prove as anything other than mechanical failure. If I hadn't had the car towed to an independent mechanic, you might have gotten away with it." Sarah's eyes flashed with pride despite herself. "I studied automotive repair for 6 months to learn how to do that properly. I wanted to make sure there would be no doubt about the cause of your accident. And the poisoning at Christmas was equally well planned. The perfect dosage to cause respiratory failure while maintaining plausible deniability about whether I had taken the drugs myself. You always were too suspicious for your own good, Sarah said with genuine frustration. Anyone else would have eaten that sandwich at the cabin and died peacefully in their sleep while the fire destroyed all the evidence. Oh, but you had to be difficult even about dying. She stopped walking and faced me directly across the fountain, raising the knife. To catch the moonlight? This is your last chance, Emma. I'm giving you the opportunity to walk away tonight and never come back. Disappear again, and I'll let you live. Try to stay and fight me for what's mine, and I'll kill you right here in this garden. What's yours? I asked, genuinely curious about her reasoning. You mean the family that gave birth to me? Inheritance that bears my name? The man who promised to marry me when we were children? I mean everything I've worked for. Sarah screamed, abandoning all pretense of control. I've spent 18 years building this life, and I won't let you destroy it just because you happened to be born first. That's when I knew she was ready to make her final mistake. Rage had overwhelmed her careful planning, and the calculating predator had been replaced by an out-of-control killer. I pressed the emergency signal hidden in my bracelet and prepared to defend myself with every skill I had learned during my years of therapy and self-defense training. Sarah lunged across the fountain with inhuman speed, the knife aimed directly at my heart. But I was ready for her attack, and instead of backing away, I moved forward to meet her charge. Years of therapy had taught me that the only way to defeat a predator was to become something they didn't expect, something more dangerous than they were prepared to handle. I caught her wrist as the knife descended, using her own momentum to throw her off balance and send her tumbling into the shallow fountain with a splash that echoed through the garden. The knife flew from her hand and skittered across the stone pathway, coming to rest near a rose bush heavy with blooms. Sarah came up sputtering and furious, her perfect hair plastered to her skull and her white gown soaked through. You think you've won? She snarled, struggling to her feet in the fountain. Even if you kill me tonight, you'll never get your life back. They love me now, Emma. They'll always love me more than they could ever love you. I don't want my old life back, I said calmly, backing away from the fountain as she climbed out dripping wet. I want a new life, one where I don't have to look over my shoulder every day, wondering when you're going to try to kill me again. The sound of running footsteps on the garden path announced the arrival of Detective Santos and 2 uniformed officers, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. They had been monitoring my location through the GPS tracker, and my emergency signal had brought them running at exactly the right moment. Sarah Mitchell, you're under arrest for attempted murder, Detective Santos announced, her weapon drawn, and trained on the soaking wet figure standing beside the fountain. Put your hands where I can see them and move away from the knife. For a moment, I thought Sarah might try to run or make one last desperate attack. But then the fight seemed to go out of her all at once, and she raised her hands in surrender. The perfect mask had finally cracked beyond repair, revealing the damaged and dangerous person she had always been underneath. As the officers handcuffed Sarah and read her rights, she looked at me with pure hatred burning in her eyes. This isn't over, Emma, she said quietly. Even from prison, I'll find a way to destroy everything you try to build. No, Sarah, I replied, watching as they led her away through the garden toward the waiting police cars. This is exactly how it ends. You lost, and I'm finally free. The engagement party continued inside the country club, most of the guests unaware that the bride-to-be had just been arrested for attempted murder in the rose garden. My parents would learn the truth soon enough, along with Danny and everyone else who had believed Sarah's lies for the past 18 years. There would be shock, denial, and probably blame directed at me for destroying their perfect narrative. But for the first time since I was 8 years old, I wasn't afraid of Sarah Mitchell anymore. The nightmare that had defined my entire life was finally over, and I could begin building something new on the ashes of what she had tried to destroy. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Click and check them out.